Let's now dig into the SQLite 3 command line interface. We'll start off with how to invoke SQLite 3 in two different modes and then proceed to the dot commands. So here are two ways to invoke SQLite 3. You have seen the second version here wherein you specify the file name, whereas here it's an in-memory instance that gets invoked because there is no file name following the SQLite 3 command invocation. What's the difference? Well, if you provide a file name, if the file name didn't exist, then the file will be created upon execution of the first command. And you can always use multiple processes. That is, multiple processes can share the same database. Whereas in the case of an in-memory instance, it is process private. That is, there is no sharing of data. Let's now see a demo to understand what it means. Here in the folder demo files, and let's now start SQLite 3 in-memory mode. And let's open another tab to create another SQLite 3 instance in in-memory mode. So two things to notice. The state of the database is in memory and transient. Transient means that once you exit the SQLite 3 prompt, all the changes that you did so far are gone. For instance, let's create a dummy table. Dummy with a field of type text here, and then insert, or nothing else is required. Now that we have a table here, if you list the tables, here you'll notice dummy show up, whereas in the second tab, if you use the dot command dot tables, the dummy table won't show up. That's what we mean by process private. Now let's just close this terminal or this shell where we created the dummy table to Control D and invoke again SQLite 3 through an in-memory instance. Now if we go ahead and invoke dot tables, you'll notice that the table dummy doesn't exist. That's what transient means. Transient means that the lifetime of all the changes that you make in the database is restricted to the lifetime of the shell, in this case being the SQLite shell. Let's now understand what it means to use files to persist the state of the database. Let's now invoke SQLite 3 with a parameter that is 1.db. At this point, the changes will be saved in the file 1.db, and you can also open another process to read the state as stored in 1.db. Let's now create a dummy table. Dummy with a field of type text. So dot tables will show dummy here. Now in case we were to invoke SQLite 3 1.db in another shell, which is the same as another process, and if you list the dot tables, you'll see that dummy shows up here as well. That's what we mean by persistent state of a database. That is, when you use a file name as a parameter, if the file name doesn't exist, it will be created. And when we opened it at the second terminal, it just made use of the created file. One another point to note is that once we close this terminal, the change is still persisted. So if we were to reopen the file 1.db and list the tables, you'll notice that the table dummy still exists. So that's what is meant by persistence and staying beyond the lifetime of the SQLite shell. Now that we know the difference between the two styles of invocation of the SQLite 3 command, you generally use an in-memory instance when you're just trying to do some sort of a scratch work to see if you understand the problem properly. Other than that, in general, for the best part, you would end up using a persistent store. Of course, if you have write issues on the particular machine where you're using SQLite 3, then also you can invoke SQLite 3 to open just an in-memory instance.